Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, the second in our two-part series, about a book called The Haunted Homes and Family Traditions of Great Britain. We're going through it, finding everything that's Elizabethan and earlier, so that they can be used as plot hooks for Magonomia and Ars Magica. These are a little bit of a stopgap because I have COVID, and I have no ability to proofread insofar as I can tell, which means it's difficult for me to script. I do apologise if I'm a little bit rambly. I had hoped to start this episode with a bang, with a story that I first became aware of when I was about 12. It was called The Hand of Father Arrowsmith when I first read it, and it's about a Catholic relic which a secret society in England has at its disposal to perform miracles up to and including the brief reanimation of the dead. Sadly, it turns out that this is a Jacobean story. Also, the version that appears in Ingram's work here is laid out very badly. So we will find another source that is less interested in discussions of architecture and which noble family succeeded which noble family at a particular house to get them to buy the book, and find one that treats the story narratively. Instead, let's pass on to what initially may seem to be a relatively simple white lady tale, but hides within it a significant occult weapon. All of these stories have been released into the public domain through LibriVox. I can't thank every reader and production team individually because there are too many, so thanks my fellow LibriVoxians.
Section 131 of The Haunted Homes and Family Traditions of Great Britain, read by Greg Giordano. Samlesbury Hall. The famous old Samlesbury Hall stands about halfway between Preston and Blackburn. It is placed in a broad plain, looking southwards towards the woody heights of Houghton, eastwards towards the lofty ridges which run through Mellor and Billington to Pendle. Preston and the broad estuary of the Ribble occupy the western prospect, whilst northwards Long Ridge, leading towards the heights of Bowland, fills the scene. Enclosing a landscape, remarks Mr. T. Wilkinson, which for picturesque beauty and historic interest has few equals in the country. Samlesbury is famed in occult lore as the place whence Grace Sourbuts and other notorious witches came. They were tried for witchcraft early in the 17th century, but escaped the fate generally meted out in those days to supposed members of the sisterhood, because, notwithstanding the fact that some of them had confessed their guilt, they were acquitted as impostors, whilst their neighbours from Tendal, Temdyke, Chaffox, etc., were condemned and hanged as genuine sorcerers. The Samlesbury witches were let off as counterfeits. The eerie reputation acquired by Samlesbury may have partially arisen in consequence of these alleged dealings in the black art by its weird daughters, but that the haunting of the old hall arose from quite a different cause local tradition guarantees. Harlan's Lancashire Legends traces the history of the famous old building back to the early part of the reign of Henry II, when Gospatrick de Samlesbury was residing in an ancestral home, occupying the site now covered by the present hall. His dwelling was surrounded by rich pastures, and was shut in by the primeval forests of oak from which the massive timbers were obtained, out of which was formed the framework of the structure still standing. This magnificent building was erected during the reign of Edward III. The family pedigrees tell us, says Harland, that Cecily de Samlesbury married John de Iwas about the middle of the 13th century, but dying without male heir, his daughter was united to Sir Gilbert de Southworth, and the property thus acquired remained in the possession of his family for upwards of 350 years. It was then sold to the Bradells, and ultimately passed into the hands of Joseph Harrison, Esquire, of Callegreaves, Blackburn, whose eldest son, William Harrison, Esquire, now resides at the Hall. After the disposal of the property by John Southworth, Esquire, in 1677, the house was suffered to fall into decay. For many years it was occupied by a number of cottagers. It was afterwards converted to a farmhouse, and passed through various stages of degradation from neglect. Mr. Harrison, however, determined that this fine old structure should be no longer thus desecrated. With a wise and just appreciation, he restored both the exterior and the interior of the house in accordance with their original design, and under his hands the old hall at Samlesbury has become one of the most interesting and instructive mansions in the county. Sir John Southworth was the most distinguished personage of his race. He was high in military command during the early years of the reign of Elizabeth. He mustered 300 men at Berwick, and served the office of Sheriff of Lancashire in 1562. His possessions included Southworth, Samlesbury, Mellor, besides lands in 18 other townships. But he was illiterate, bigoted, and self-willed. His rigid devotion to the faith of his ancestors led him to speak rashly of the changes introduced into the national religion. He also acted unwisely in contravening the laws, for which he was ultimately cast into prison, and otherwise treated with much severity until his death in 1595. Tradition states that during his later years one of his daughters had formed an acquaintance with the heir of a neighboring knightly house. The attachment was mutual, and nothing was wanting to complete their happiness except the consent of the lady's father. Sir John was thereupon consulted, but the tale of their devoted attachment only served to increase his rage, and he dismissed the supplicants with the most embittered denunciations. No daughter of his should ever be united to the son of a family which had deserted its ancestral faith, and he forbade the youth his presence forever. Difficulty, however, only served to increase the ardor of the devoted lovers, and after many secret interviews among the wooded slopes of the Ribble, an elopement was agreed upon, in the hope that time would bring her father's pardon. The day and place were unfortunately overheard by one of the lady's brothers, who was hiding in a thicket close by, and he determined to prevent what he considered to be his sister's disgrace. On the evening agreed upon, both parties met at the hour appointed, and as the young knight moved away with his betrothed, her brother rushed from his hiding place, and slew both him and 2 friends by whom he was accompanied. The bodies were secretly buried within the precincts of the domestic chapel at the Hall, and Lady Dorothy was sent abroad to a convent where she was kept under strict surveillance. Her mind at last gave way, the name of her murdered lover was ever on her lips, and she died a raving maniac. Some years ago 3 human skeletons were found near the walls of the Hall, and popular opinion has connected them with the tradition. The legend also states that on certain clear, still evenings, a lady in white can be seen passing along the gallery and the corridors, and then from the hall into the grounds, that she then meets a handsome knight, who receives her on his bended knees, and he then accompanies her along the walks. On arriving at a certain spot, most probably the lover's grave, both the phantoms stand still, and as they seem to utter soft wailings of despair, they embrace each other, and then their forms rise slowly from the earth and melt away into the clear blue of the surrounding sky.
Let's assume the wails of the ascending dead are dangerous, either physically or psychologically. They are certainly terrifying to the people in period. Let us further assume that the site from which they ascend is the grave of the lover. Now, in period theology, the place of the skull is the place of the grave. That is, if bodies are scattered, wherever the head is, that's where the formal grave is. This means that if you take the skull out of the grave and you bury it somewhere else, the knight will come there and meet his lady there, and they will ascend screaming into the sky from there. So, if you've got someone you hate very much and you can be assured that they will be at home on a particular day, you can essentially put an occult landmine in their basement. And then, the next morning, when people are scouring through, trying to work out why everyone in the building has been driven mad, You can pick up the skull, carry it somewhere safe, be nowhere near it on the next appropriate day, but if you wanted, you could put it in another enemy's basement. Over and over again, once a year, killing an enemy, leaving no forensic traces except a skull to which you have no particular attachment. Eventually, perhaps, some ghostly knights would turn up and hassle you, but you're a magician. You can deal with them, presumably.
Section 137 of The Haunted Homes and Family Traditions of Great Britain. Section 137, Sykes Lub Farm. In a secluded dell on the banks of Mellor Brook, says Mr. T.T. Wilkinson, not far from the famous Old Hall of Samlesbury, near Blackburn, a haunted old hall, whereof an account will be found in these pages, stands a lonely farmhouse, which was occupied for many generations by a family named Sykes. They gave their name to the homestead, or vice versa, on its being cleared from the forest, and from the fact of the pastures lying at a short distance from a broad and deep portion of the brook, it became generally known by the name of Sykes Lub Farm. This Sykes family, however, as Mr. Wilkinson records, have long since passed to dust, and many generations of strangers have dwelt on their lands. But the doings of one particular member of the race have been handed down, from year to year, by tradition, and still exercise a potent influence upon the minds of the surrounding population. Before referring to the especial tradition for which Sykes Lub Farm is noted, it may be as well to point out that it possesses an uncanny reputation for a supernatural inhabitant, other than the apparition from which its fame is chiefly derived. In one work by Mr. Wilkinson, it is referred to as the residence of a noted boggart, or domestic familiar, in these terms: when in good humour, this noted goblin will milk the cows, pull the hay, fodder the cattle, harness the horses, load the carts, and stack the crops. When irritated by the utterance of some unguarded expression or mock disrespect, either from the farmer or his servants, the cream mugs are then smashed to atoms. No butter can be obtained by churning. The horses and other cattle are turned loose or driven into the woods. 2 cows will sometimes be found fastened in the same stall. No hay can be pulled from the mow, and all the while the wicked imps sit gritting with delight upon one of the crossbeams in the barn. At other times the horses are unable to draw the empty carts across the farmyard. If loaded, they are upset, whilst the cattle tremble with fear without any visible cause, nor do the inmates of the house experience any better or gentler usage. During the night the clothes are said to be violently torn from off the beds of the offending parties, whilst, by invisible hands, they themselves are dragged down the stone stairs by the legs, one step at a time, after a most uncomfortable manner. The way in which this boggart is described as haunting Sykes Lub Farm is in no way out of the common, especially in Lancashire and the neighbouring counties. But it is of interest in this case as showing the popular belief that the place is troubled in some way. In what way the house and grounds are really believed to be, or until recently to have been, haunted, is thus described in Roby and Wilkinson's Lancashire Legends and William Dobson's Rambles by the Riddle. In the days when the farm was owned by old Sykes and his wife, careful living and more than ordinary thrift enabled the old couple to gather together a fair amount of wealth, which, added to the continual hoarding of the farmer's ancestor, caused the pair to be regarded as wonderfully rich in those days. Whatever the facts as to their wealth may have been, they saw its possession ultimately jeopardized by civil troubles and national famine. It was their chief, if not their only object of affection, as they had neither son nor daughter, nor any other object upon which to expend their love. Therefore, the risk of losing it gave them more than ordinary anxiety. Old Sykes does not appear to have clung to the darling hoard with half the affection displayed by his worthy consort, whose dread of losing it was intense. Besides, says our chief authority, she had no notion of becoming dependent upon the bounty of the southwards of the Hall, nor did she relish the idea of soliciting charity at the gates of the lordly abbot of Whalley. The treasure was therefore carefully secured in earthenware jars, and was then buried deep beneath the roots of an apple tree in the orchard. Years passed away, and the troubles of the country did not cease. The Yorkists at length lost the ascendancy, and the reins of the government passed into the hands of the Lancastrians, until at last the northern feud was healed by the mingling of the white rose with the red. Henry VII sat upon the throne with Elizabeth of York as queen, but ere peace thus blessed the land, old Sikes had paid the debt of nature and left his widow the sole possessor of their buried wealth. She, too, soon passed away, and as the legend asserts, so suddenly that she had no opportunity to disclose the place where she had deposited their treasure. Rumor had not failed to give her the credit of being possessed of considerable wealth, but although her relatives made diligent search, they were unsuccessful in discovering the place of the hidden jars. The farm passed into other hands, and old Sikes's wife might have been forgotten, had not her ghost, unable to find rest, continued occasionally to visit the old farmhouse. Many a time, in the dusk of the evening, have the neighboring peasants met an old wrinkled woman, dressed in ancient garb, passing along the gloomy road which leads across the Lum. But fear always prevented them from speaking. She never lifted her head, but helped herself noiselessly along by means of a crooked stick, which bore no resemblance to those then in use. At times she was seen in the old barn, on other occasions in the house, but more frequently in the orchard, standing by an apple tree, which still flourished over the place where the buried treasure was afterwards said to have been found. Generations passed away, and still her visits continued. One informant minutely described her withered visage, her short, quaintly cut gown, her striped petticoat, and her stick. He was so much alarmed that he ran away from the place, notwithstanding that he had engaged to perform some urgent work. She was not there, he gravely said, when I went to pluck an apple, but no sooner did I raise my hand towards the fruit than she made her appearance just before me. At last, it is said, an occupier of the farm, when somewhat elated by liquor, ventured to question her as to the reasons of her visits. She returned no answer, but, after moving slowly towards the stump of an old apple tree, she pointed significantly towards a portion of the orchard which had never been disturbed. On search being made, the treasure was found deep down in the earth, and as the soil was being removed, the venerable-looking shade was seen standing on the edge of the trench. When the last jar was lifted out, an unearthly smile passed over her withered features. Her bodily form became less and less distinct, until at last it disappeared altogether. Since then, the old farmhouse has ceased to be haunted. Old Sikes's wife is believed to have found eternal rest. But there are yet many, both old and young, who walk with quickened pace past the Lum whenever they are belated, fearful lest they should be once more confronted with the dreaded form of its unearthly visitor.
So wizards with a somewhat more open mindset could try and find this ghost. I mean, I'm not sure what the members of the public here are scared of. They believe in life after death anyway, so seeing a ghost doesn't confront them with that. She's in no way violent, and if you see her, occasionally she'll point to a stump with treasure in it. What more could you want from a local spook? Sorry, I just don't understand why that one's a horror story.
Section 140 of the Haunted Homes and Family Traditions of Great Britain, Watteau Hall. Mr. William Dobson's interesting rambles by the Ribble furnish one or two accounts of local dwellings laboring under the uncanny odor of being haunted. Mr. Dobson, although evidently no believer in ghosts and unable to resist the temptation of having a fling at their erratic courses, tells of their doings with a chronicler's exactitude. Writing in 1864, our authority says that Watteau Hall in the township of Waddington, Yorkshire, was then in the occupation of James Garnett, Esquire, Mayor of Clitheroe. The property of the Ramsden family. Watteau Hall is situated in a pleasant park, which, though not of great extent, is of great beauty. The house stands on a knoll, with pleasant woodlands about it. At the foot of a gentle slope flows the Ribble. The castle and church of Clitheroe are seen to advantage, the smoke only indicating where the town of Clitheroe lies, an intervening hill hiding the town itself from view. The mansion contains many portraits of its former owners and various members of their family, but the main interest of Watteau appears to arise from its being the scene of an old legend which the folks of Clitheroe and the neighbouring Yorkshire villages are never weary of repeating, and for the truth of which they are perfectly willing to vouch. Many of the older inhabitants of Clitheroe and Waddington would as soon doubt the Scriptures as they would a single iota of the following tradition. In the grounds of Waddow, and near the banks of the Ribble, there is a spring called Pego Nell's well, and good water the spring sendeth forth in plenty. Near the spring is a headless, now almost shapeless figure, said to be a representation of the famous Peg herself. Pego Nell, as I learned, says Mr. Dobson, was a young woman who in days of yore was a servant at Waddow Hall. On one occasion she was going to the well for water, the very well that to this day supplies the hall with water for culinary purposes. She had a quarrel with the lord or lady of Waddow, who in a spirit of anger, not common, it is to be hoped, with masters and mistresses, wished that she might fall and break her neck. It was winter, and the ground was coated with ice. Her pattens tripped in some way or other. Peggy fell, and the sad malediction was fully realized. To be revenged on her evil wisher, Peggy was wont to revisit her former home in the spirit, and torment her master and mistress by making night hideous. Every disagreeable noise that was heard at Waddow was attributed to Peggy. Every accident that occurred in the neighbourhood was through Peggy. No chicken was stolen, no cow died, no sheep strayed, no child was ill, no youth took bad ways, but Peg was the evil genius. When a Waddow farmer had stopped too long at the Dule Upsdon, and going home late, had slipped off the hipping stones at Brungerley into the river, or a Clitheroe Burgess, when in Bowland, had, like Tam o' Shanter, sat too long fast by an ingle bleezing finely, while the ale was growing better, and had fallen off his horse in going home, and broken a limb, it was not the host's liquor that was charged with the mishap, but on Peggy's shoulders that the blame was laid. What was worse, in addition to these perpetual annoyances, every 7 years Peg required a life, and the story is that Peg's night, as the time of sacrifice at each anniversary was called, was duly observed, and if no living animal were ready as a septennial offering to her manes, a human being became inexorably the victim. Consequently, it grew to be the custom on Peg's night to drown a bird, or a cat, or dog in the river, and a life being thus given for another 7 years, Peggy was appeased. One night at an inn in the neighbourhood, as the wind blew, and the rattling showers rose on the blast, and as the swollen Ribble roared over the hipping stones, a young man, not in the soberest mood, had to go from Waddington to Clitheroe. No bridge then spanned the Ribble at Bungerley. The only means of crossing the river was by the stones which Henry VI, in his last struggle for liberty, had tripped over towards Clitherwood. He was told he must not venture over the water, it was not safe. He must be at Clitheroe that night, was his response, and go he would. But, said the young woman of the inn, by way of climax to the other arguments used to induce him not to go onward, it's Paganel's night, and she has not had her life. He cared not for Paganel. He laughed at her alleged requirement, gave loose to his horse's rein, and was soon at Bungerley. The following morning, horse and rider had alike perished, and of course many believed the calamity was through Peg's malevolence. Peg, it is averred, is still as insatiable as ever, and many would dread to dare her wrath.
So a living embodiment of Murphy's Law, that every 7 years becomes more and more powerful until a life is given to her or she claims one herself. Even if you aren't anywhere in the area, it seems like a useful thing to be able to call her up. For a magician to be able to call up a spirit that can absolutely sow confusion among their enemies, process drowning a chicken. I mean, if you're one of those carnivorous people, you could just eat the chicken afterwards. It seems an incredibly economical spell. And here, dear reader, your narrator pauses annoyed, finding that the Screaming Skull story, intended to round out this episode, is Jacobean. I'll recycle that for Halloween. Let's use one of the long stories that I'd cut out because they were more than 10 minutes.
Section 101 of The Haunted Homes and Family Traditions of Great Britain, read by Greg Giordano, Burton Agnes Hall. Amongst the haunted houses of Great Britain, those which are the permanent residence of certain skulls are the most curious.
Well, there's a bit of luck. I knew I had another skull story in here somewhere.
Various grand old halls, quaint farmhouses, and ancient dwellings scattered about the kingdom are troubled at times by all kinds of supernatural disturbances, in consequence of some long and carefully preserved skull being removed from its resting place, or otherwise interfered with. These pages furnish several singular instances of such legends connected with old ancestral dwellings, but none more curious or devoutly believed in than that connected with Burton Agnes Hall, the family seat of Sir Henry Somerville Boynton. Burton Agnes is a picturesque village between Bridlington and Driffield, in the East Riding of Yorkshire. It has some pretty cottages, a handsome church containing several splendid tombs of the Boynton, Griffiths, and Somerville families, one of the last dating back to 1336, and the grand old hall, the residence of the Boyntons. The village, which is chiefly, if not entirely, owned by the Boyntons, lies on the slope of the Wolds. A long chain of hills sweep round it from Flamborough, head on the north, whence extensive views over the lowlands of Holderness are obtainable. The Hall, says Mr. F. Ross, from whose interesting article in the Leeds Mercury much of the following information is derived, is a large and picturesque building of red brick with stone coins, a mixture of the Tudor, Elizabethan, and Jacobean styles, with a long broken facade, ornamented with octagonal bays in the wings and mullioned windows. In the interior are a grand hall, with a fine carved screen, behind which is the magnificent staircase, a noble gallery, containing a choice collection of paintings, an apartment which has not its equal for many miles. All the chief apartments are profusely ornamented with carved woodwork, over the fireplace of the hall being a curious specimen representing the Empire of Death. Inigo Jones is said to have designed the hall, and Rubens to have decorated some portions of the interior. Inwardly and outwardly, this English home is as magnificent as it is curious yet comfortable. From the grand entrance gateway, an avenue of yew trees stretches away to the porch of the hall, producing a picturesque effect.
Just popping in to note that yew trees are associated with death in English folklore because yew was necessary to make longbows, but its leaves are poisonous and kill sheep. And so, to stop sheep being poisoned, yew trees were traditionally planted in graveyards, from which sheep were excluded by walls and fences so that they didn't crap all over people's ancestors. This meant that much as the frangipani is associated with death in other parts of the world, the yew is associated with death in England. So a line of yew trees, not too creepy, but since you've got the Empire of Death thing going on, creepy-ish.
Standing, as the edifice does, on an elevation, the panorama seen over the surrounding neighborhood from its windows is both grand and impressive. Altogether, Burton Agnes Hall might be deemed, in every respect, a desirable dwelling. But there is a skeleton, or rather, a portion of one, in this splendid mansion. In the course of centuries, the estates had passed, by descent, into possession of the De Somervilles, Griffiths, and Boynton families, until they became vested in the persons of three sisters, co-heiresses. A painting at the Hall represents these three ladies in costumes of the Elizabethan period, and in one of the upper rooms is the portrait of a lady, apparently one of these three, the bodily representative of the spirit which haunts the ancient mansion. and who is familiarly and irreverently called Auld Nance by the domestics. The skull of this lady is preserved at the Hall, much against the will, it is averred, of the inhabitants thereof, but it is more than mortal dare do to remove it. When this relic of mortality is left quietly upon its resting place, all goes well. Whenever any attempt is made to remove it, most diabolical disturbances and unearthly noises are raised in the house, and last until it is restored.
I am never entirely sure why the people in various versions of this story decide to take it out of its little cupboard and throw it away. In the changeover from Catholicism to Protestantism, where they're going, oh, let us get rid of all the old superstition. Maybe, but it's just some dude's head. Why not leave it in the cupboard? I have comic books on the top of one of my cupboards that I haven't read in 30 years. On editing this, I realize how strange that sounds. I wish to emphasize that I do not at this time, or at any previous time, have anyone's head in my cupboard, or any other place. My wife being a fundamentally spooky person, we do, of course, have many, many versions and copies of skulls, but it's very difficult to get them ethically, you know. Let's move on.
The story to account for these phenomena, as told by Mr. Ross, is as follows. The three ladies, co-heiresses of the estate of Burton Agnes, were in possession of considerable wealth, and had very exalted ideas of the dignity of the family. For a while they resided in the ancient mansion, which had been the home of several generations of Griffiths and Somervilles, but it had become dilapidated and was altogether out of fashion with the existing Elizabethan style of architecture, now emerging into the Jacobean, and the three ladies began to think it altogether too mean for the residence of so important a family as theirs. They had many consultations on the subject, and, at length, determined to erect a hall in such a style as should eclipse the splendour all the mansions in the neighbourhood, even that of the mighty Earls of Northumberland at Leconfield, a few miles distant. The most active promoter of the scheme was Anne, the younger sister, who could talk, think, and dream of nothing but the magnificent home to be erected for themselves and their descendants. Money they had in abundance. They called in the best architects of the day to furnish designs. Bricklayers, masons, and carpenters were seen at work building up the mansion. And then, for the decorative portions, the genius of Inigo Jones and the talents of Rubens were employed on whatever portion of the interior that was susceptible of artistic treatment. In process of time, it emerged from the hands of artists and workmen like a palace erected by the genii of the Arabian Nights, a palace encrusted throughout on walls, roof, and furniture with the most exquisite carvings and sculptures of the most skilled masters of the age, and radiant with the most glowing tints of the pencil of Peter Paul. Of the three sisters, Anne took the most lively interest in the new house. She witnessed the uprising walls, the development of the architectural features of the grand façade, and the outgrowth of the chiseled design of the interior under the cunning handicraft of the carvers and sculptors, with the most rapturous delight, and, when it was completed, could never sufficiently admire its symmetrical proportions, noble hall, stately gallery, and manifold artistic enrichments. Some little time after its completion and occupation by its lady owners, Anne, the enthusiast, paid an afternoon visit to the St. Quintins at Harpham, about nightfall proposing to return home. She was wholly unattended, excepting by a dog, as the houses were only about a mile apart, singing merrily as she went along. As she approached St. John's Well, she perceived two ruffianly-looking mendicants stretched on the grass by its side. This was a very numerous and dangerous class, since the dissolution of the monasteries, at whose gates they had been supplied with food, and lived by traversing the country, and going from abbey to priory and priory to abbey, being generally too lazy to apply themselves to work. And although parochial poor laws had been passed in the 2 or 3 preceding reigns, it had been left in a great measure to the people to contribute to the poor funds, more by way of a benevolence than as a compulsory rate, so that many parishes shirked the collection altogether, and thus the roads of the country and the streets of the towns swarmed with sturdy beggars, who would take no denial when they were able to demand alms by threats and violence. The lady approached them with some tremor, but did not feel much fear, as she was still within the precincts of Harpham, and not far from those who would afford her protection. The men rose as she came up to them, and asked alms, and she drew out her purse and gave them a few coins. But in doing so, the glitter of her finger ring attracted their notice, and, in a threatening tone, they demanded that it should be given up to them. As it was an heirloom that she inherited from her mother, she valued it above all price, and declared she could not, on any account, give up her mother's ring. "Mother or no mother," replied one of the men in a gruff tone, "we mean to have it, and if you do not bestow it freely, we must take it." So saying, he seized her hand, and attempted to draw off the ring. At this manifestation of violence she screamed aloud for help, when the other ruffian, exclaiming, "Stop that noise!" struck her a blow on the head with his stick, and she fell senseless to the earth. Her screams had reached the village, and some rustics came hurrying up, upon which the villains made a hasty retreat, without being able to get the ring from her finger. She was found, as it was supposed, dead or dying, and was carried carefully to Harpham Hall, where, under the care of Lady St. Quintin and the application of restoratives, she recovered sufficiently to be removed the following day to her home. Although she was restored to sensibility, she was suffering acutely from the blow, and was placed in bed in a state of utter prostration. She remained so for a few days, becoming weaker gradually, until, despite the tender nursing of her sisters and the best medical advice that York could afford, she fell a victim to the brutal attack of the robbers, and was buried in the church of Burton Agnes. During these few intervening days she was alternately sensible and delirious, but in whichever state she was, her thoughts seemed to turn on what had latterly been the passion of her life, her affection for her fondly loved home. "Sisters," said she, "never shall I sleep peacefully in my grave in the churchyard, unless I, or a part of me at least, remain here in our beautiful home as long as it lasts. Promise me this, dear sisters, that when I am dead, my head shall be taken from my body and preserved within these walls. Here let it for ever remain, and on no account be removed. And understand and make it known to those who in future shall become possessors of the house, that if they disobey this my last injunction, my spirit shall, if so able and so permitted, make such disturbance within its walls as to render it uninhabitable for others so long as my head is divorced from its home." Her sisters, to pacify her, promised to obey her instructions, but without any intention of keeping the promise, and the body was laid entire and unmutilated under the pavement of the church. About a week after the interment, as the inhabitants of the hall were preparing one evening to retire to rest, they were alarmed by a sudden and loud crash in one of the upstairs rooms. The 2 sisters and the domestics rushed up together in great consternation, but after much trembling came to the conclusion that some heavy piece of furniture had fallen, and the manservants, of whom there were 2 in the house, went upstairs to ascertain the cause of the noise, but were not able to find anything to account for it. The household became still more alarmed at this report, and for a long time were afraid to go to bed. but hearing nothing further, at length retired, and the night passed away without further disturbance. Nothing more occurred until the same night in the following week, when the inmates were aroused from sleep in the dead of the night by a loud clapping to, seemingly, of half a dozen of the doors. With fear-stricken countenances and hair standing on end, they struck lights and mustered up sufficient courage to go over the house. They found all the doors closed, but for a while the clapping continued, but always in a different part of the house, remote from where they were. At length the disturbance ceased, and as nothing untoward followed the noise of the preceding week, they again ventured to return to their beds, where they lay sleepless and quaking with fear until daylight. Another week of quietness passed away, but on the corresponding night they were again disturbed by what appeared to be a crowd of persons hurrying along the galleries and up and down the stairs, which was followed by a sound of groaning as from a dying person. On this occasion they were all too terrified to leave their beds, but lay crouching under the bedclothes, perspiring with fear. The following day the female servants fled from the house, refusing to remain any longer in companionship with the ghost, which, they all concluded, was the author of the unearthly noises. The two ladies took counsel with their neighbor, Mr. afterwards Sir William St. Quintin, and the vicar of the parish. In the course of conversation it occurred to them that the noises took place on the same night of the week that Anne had died, and the sisters remembered her dying words, and their promise that some part of her body should be preserved in the house. Also her threat that if her wish were not complied with, she would, if she were so permitted, render the house uninhabitable for others.
Honestly, a dry skull in a box is one of the simplest roommates to care for. I've had roommates who left food on the stove for days so that it fermented. I've had roommates who left blood through the... No, let's just not go there. I'm just saying all the lady wants to do is have a head in her house. I mean, honestly, what's wrong with these people?
And it appeared evident that she was carrying out her threats. The question then was, what was to be done in order to carry out her wish? And the clergyman suggested that the coffin should be opened to see if that could throw any light on the matter. This was done the following day, when a ghastly spectacle presented itself. The body lay without any marks of corruption or decay, but the head was disengaged from the trunk and appeared to be rapidly assuming the semblance of a fleshless skull. This was reported to the ladies, who, although terrified at the idea, agreed to the suggestion of the vicar.
Terrified ladies. The sister's being really convenient here. She's like, hey, my latest spooky trick is to make the bit that you're taking away thoroughly portable. I think my COVID medication may be affecting my thoughts. But on we go.
That the skull should be brought to the house, which was done, and so long as it was allowed to remain undisturbed on the table where it was placed.
This, I would stress, is not the main dining table, it's a little side table. I believe that eventually it was put into a little cupboard under a stairway? No, I think that's Charlie, who's a different Screaming Skull. We have to do something with Screaming Skulls in Magonomia. I like the idea of them as an alarm system. I also like them as a sort of news relay system. Every so often, the skull on top of one building screams to the skull on top of another building, and so on. And it's sort of like the high-pitched warbling that you used to get when you would dial into the internet. I'm showing my age. But that would freak out some Elizabethans. Anyway, moving on.
The house was not troubled with visitations of a ghostly nature. Many attempts have since been made to rid the hall of the skull, but without success, as whenever it has been removed, the ghostly knockings have been resumed, and no rest or peace enjoyed until it has been restored.
I presume it's thoroughly clear, completely on the skull's side here.
On one occasion a maidservant threw it from the window upon a passing load of manure, but from that moment the horses were not able to move the wagon an inch, and despite the vigorous whipping of the wagoner, all their efforts were in vain, until the servant confessed what she had done, when the skull was brought back into the house, and the horses drew the wagon along without the least difficulty.
Were I a powerful haunting spirit, and were I to ask for something as simple as to be allowed to stay in my own home, and were you to throw me into a load of animal manure, I would do rather more, I believe, than stop the cart from moving.
On another, one of the Boyntons caused it to be buried in the garden, when the most dismal wailings and cries kept the house in a state of disquietude and alarm until it was dug up and restored to its place in the hall, when they ceased.
I wonder whether the wailings and cries were, "Young man, you get your fecking spade and come down here and get me out of this garden right now, or so help me, I will come up there and haunt you." Again, I'm Team Nance all the way on this.
A correspondent of Mr. Ross, to whom, indeed, that gentleman was indebted for some of the particulars already given, furnished him with the following account of his own personal experience of the Burton Agnes hauntings, gained during a night spent at the Hall. He writes, "Some 40 years ago, John Bilton, a cousin of mine, came from London on a visit to the neighbourhood, and having a relative, Matthew Potter, who was a gamekeeper on the estate and resided in the Hall, he paid him a visit and was invited to pass the night there. Potter, however, told him that according to popular report the house was haunted, and that if he were afraid of ghosts he had better sleep elsewhere. But John, who was a daredevil sort of a fellow, altogether untinctured by superstitious fancies, replied, 'Afraid? Not I, indeed. I care not how many ghosts there may be in the house, so long as they do not molest me.' Potter then told him of the skull and the portrait of Odd Nance, and asked him if he would like to see the latter. The skull, it would appear, from what followed, was not then in the house. He replied that he should like to see the picture, and they passed into the room where it was hanging, and Potter held up the candle before the portrait, when, in a moment, and without any apparent cause, the candle became extinguished, and defied all attempts at blowing in again, and they were obliged to grope their way to the bedroom in the dark. They occupied the same bed, and Potter was soon asleep and snoring, but Bilton, ruminating over the tale of the skull, and the curious circumstance of the sudden extinguishment of the light in front of the portrait of the ghost, lay awake. When he had lain musing for half an hour, he heard a shuffling of feet outside the chamber door, which at first he ascribed to the servants going to bed. But as the sounds did not cease, but kept increasing, he nudged his bedfellow and said, "Matty, what the deuce is all that row about?" "Ginny Hewlett's owls," replied his companion in a half-waking tone, and turning over again began to snore. The noises became more uproarious, and it seemed as if 10 or a dozen persons were scuffling about in the passage just outside, and rushing in and out of the rooms, slamming the doors with great violence, upon which he gave his friend another vigorous nudge in the ribs, exclaiming, "Wake up, Matty! Don't you hear that confounded row? What does it all mean?" "Ginny Hewlett's," again muttered his bedfellow. "Ginny Hewlett's," replied Bilton. "Ginny Hewlett's can't make such an infernal uproar as that." Matty, who was now more awakened, listened a moment and then said, "It's Odd Nance, but I never took any notice of her." And he rolled over and again began to snore.
And there is a sensible young man.
After this, the fun grew fast and furious. A struggling fight seemed to be going on outside, and the clapping of the doors reverberated in the passage like thunderclaps. He expected every moment to see the chamber door fly open.
As mentioned in the previous episode, people in this period don't seem to expect ghosts to walk through doors. They expect the doors to burst open magically and a physical ghost to stride into a room.
and awed Nance with a troop of ghosts come rushing in. But no such catastrophe occurred, and after a while the noises ceased, and about daylight he fell asleep. The writer adds that his cousin, though a fear-naught and a thorough disbeliever in the supernatural, told him that he never passed so fearful a night before in his life. It would not sleep another night in the place if he were offered the hall itself for doing so. He further adds that his cousin was a thoroughly truthful man, who might be implicitly believed, and that he had the narrative from his own lips on the following day.
And that's our lot for the week. I've really enjoyed this. It could be that it's very early in the morning, that I have COVID brain, and that I'm having a funny reaction to my anti-COVID drugs, but this was a great deal of fun to put together. So, I'm going to move around the schedule and add a third episode of Haunted Houses using the longer stories in 2 weeks' time. Next week, Our Ladies of Death, which is a fan of Charles Swinburne, wrote City of Dreadful Night. No, can't find it. Added later, B.V. Thompson. Anyway, Monsters next week, Ghosts the week after, Cellini the week after that. Your saga may vary. Oh, I seem to have deleted the sound bumper that goes at the end. Do-do-do-do.